Okay, this is the review PowerPoint for the early colonies. Start looking at the characteristics of the early exploration and settlement. We'll start with the very first permanent English settlement in the New World. That was Jamestown, 1607. You need to know that that was settled by a company, a joint stock company called the Virginia Company of London, and it was a business venture. You should also know that in Virginia we established the House of Burgesses by the 1640s. This was the first elected assembly, the first legislature in the New World. The first elected legislature in the New World. It has operated continuously and is known today as the General Assembly of Virginia. So there are three regions that you need to know about of the 13 colonies, and that's the New England region, that's in yellow, the Middle Atlantic region, and Virginia and the southern colonies. So we'll start with the New England region. New England was settled by Puritans. They left England because they were seeking freedom from religious persecution. You may remember that they signed the Mayflower Compact. They formed communities. We call them covenant communities based on the principles of the Mayflower Compact and Puritan religious beliefs. Puritans are often intolerant of those not sharing their religion, which is kind of ironic because they left England because people didn't tolerate them. So the Puritans didn't like people who didn't think like them. They also sought economic opportunity, and they practiced a form of direct democracy through town meetings, and we'll talk about them later. The Middle Atlantic region is settled chiefly by English, Dutch, and German-speaking immigrants seeking religious freedom and economic opportunity. The middle region, just remember the letter M. The middle region is our mix. Alright, so it has a mix of religions and it has a mix of ethnic groups, the English, the Dutch, and the Germans. Virginia and the southern colonies are settled by people seeking economic opportunities. Some of these early Virginia settlers, not a whole lot of them, but some of them were Cavaliers. This is the name that we give to very, very rich people from England. Basically, they were friends of the king, and the king kind of owed them gifts and favors, and he ended up giving them lots of land in Virginia, land that really was kind of easy for the king to give away because, you know, he really didn't own it. The English said they owned it, but so a lot of the early plantations are going to be land grants that the king is going to give to these Cavaliers on the east coast of England, of Virginia. Poor English immigrants also came seeking better lives. They tended to be small farmers or artisans, and in the southern area they settled in the Shenandoah Valley or western Virginia. Some of them also came as indentured servants. Indentured servants agreed to work on tobacco plantations for a period of time to pay for their passage to the New World. So these poor folks who became indentured servants, they couldn't afford a ticket on a ship, but they would agree to work for a period of years, and that would pay off their ticket, which would be bought for them by someone who was richer, someone who owned a tobacco plantation. Now, obviously, when the Europeans came over, it was going to be a pretty big deal, not only for the Europeans who came over, but for the African slaves that came over with them and the American Indians who were already there. So the explorations and settlement of the English in the American colonies and the Spanish in the Caribbean, Central America and South America often led to violent conflicts with the American Indians. So when you think about the Spanish and the English, think violence. The Spanish and the English tended to have very strained relations with Native Americans. The Indians lost their traditional territories and fell victim to diseases carried from Europe. However, the French had a more positive relationship. So by contrast, the French exploration of Canada did not lead to large-scale immigration. So the Spanish and the English came over in bigger numbers. The French came over in smaller groups, and because of this, they tended to have better relations with Native Americans, largely because of the fur trade. So in the pictures of the comic strips that you have here, you can see the top one, you can see the Spanish. When they first came over, a lot of them were looking for gold and were very brutal in their treatment of Native Americans when they couldn't find gold. You can see the bottom picture though, that's a French fur trader having a much more positive relationship with a Native American. The growth of an agricultural economy based on large land holdings in the southern colonies and in the Caribbean led to the introduction of slavery in the New World. The first Africans were brought against their will to Jamestown in 1619 to work on tobacco plantations. So when we talk about North America, the first slaves are brought to Jamestown kind of by accident in 1619, and this is an artist's rendition of what happened. All right, let's talk about economic characteristics. Let's start with New England. When you think New England, think shipbuilding, fishing, lumbering, small-scale subsistence farming, and eventually manufacturing. These colonies are going to prosper, and one of the things that helps them to prosper is the Puritans' belief system, the Puritans' values of hard work and thrift. Remember, the Puritans believed that God had already decided who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. And the Puritans therefore believed that the way you lived your life on earth was a pretty good indication of whether you were going to heaven or hell. And this is sometimes known as the Protestant work ethic, and the SOL calls it hard work and thrift. So when you think of Puritan New England, think hard work and thrift. The middle colonies of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware developed economies based on shipbuilding, small-scale farming, and trading. Cities such as New York and Philadelphia began to grow seaports and/or commercial centers. So this graphic shows you that in 1760, our two biggest cities in the colonies were both in the middle colonies, Philadelphia and New York City. And this is simple geography. Philadelphia and New York have very wide, deep rivers which allowed lots of ships to go through. And it promoted trade. And last but not least, the economic characteristics of the colonial period in the South. Southern colonies developed economies in the eastern coastal, developed plantations in the eastern coastal lowlands based on cash crops such as tobacco, rice, and indigo. Farther inland, however, in the mountains and the valleys of the Appalachian foothills, the economy is based there on small-scale subsistence farming, hunting, and trading. So this is a simple east-west split in the South. In the east, you're talking about plantations. In the west, you're talking about more subsistence farming and smaller trading. So again, this is tied to geography. In the east coast, you're talking about flat, fertile land on the coastal lowlands, all right, and the plantations developed there. In the Valley and Ridge area where we live, the economy isn't based on these plantations because the land just wasn't suited to that kind of economy. So you're talking about smaller scale farming, hunting, and trading. A strong belief in private ownership of property and free enterprise characterized colonial life in the 13 colonies. Every single colony showed this private ownership of property and free enterprise. Let's talk about social characteristics. New England's social characteristics based on religious standing. The Puritans, remember, grew increasingly intolerant of dissenters. That word means people who disagreed with them. So anyone who challenged Puritan belief, especially their belief in the connection between religion and government, the Puritans became more and more upset with those people. And the colony that we focus on that was founded because of this is Rhode Island. Rhode Island was founded by dissenters, that's people who disagreed with Puritans, and they fled persecution by Puritans in Massachusetts. All right, here's a map that shows you the New England colonies, and you can see Rhode Island right there is the one that's founded by people fleeing religious persecution. Rhode Island is kind of the odd colony out. All the other Puritan colonies are very, very similar, and they think a lot the same way, but Rhode Island was always kind of the odd colony out, and it was founded by people who left Massachusetts. Interestingly, when we signed the Constitution, Rhode Island is the last colony, the last state that ratifies the Constitution. All right, the Middle Atlantic colonies, again, remember the key letter here is M. The middle colonies are the mix. They are home to multiple religious groups. All right, we're talking the Quakers in Pennsylvania, the Huguenots and Jews in New York, and the Presbyterians in New Jersey. These colonies had more flexible social structures and began to develop a middle class of skilled artisans, entrepreneurs, and small farmers. So this is the area that people went to be tolerated. Think of the Amish who live today in Pennsylvania. All right, there's a reason they're in Pennsylvania. They went there because they knew they would be tolerated by people living in the middle colonies. And Virginia and the other southern colonies had a social structure based on family status and the ownership of land. Large landowners in the eastern lowlands dominated colonial government and society and maintained an allegiance to the Church of England and closer social ties to Britain than those in the other colonies. In the mountains and the valleys further inland, however, society was characterized by small subsistence farmers, hunters, and traders of Scots-Irish and English descent. One last thing to talk about in terms of society, and that was the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening is a religious movement that swept both Europe and the colonies during the middle of the 1700s. In the colonies, what it does is it leads to the rapid growth of certain religions. We call them evangelical religions, Methodist, Baptist, and these religions are going to challenge the established order of the day, the established religious order, the old churches. So they challenged like the old churches like the Church of England, and they also challenged the way that people were governing at the time. And some historians see a link between the Great Awakening and the American Revolution. And I like this graphic from a comic strip that I use. You can see the Great Awakening. It's when we say evangelical, that's just a fancy word. It means that religion grew more passionate. So during this time period, the Great Awakening saw church services go from this, where it's kind of like, you look, that guy's yawning, it's kind of boring, to this outdoor service where people are much more passionate and experiencing religion. Political characteristics of the colonial period. New England colonies used town meetings, an Athenian direct democracy model in the operation of government. Town meetings are basically where the adult male members of the church attended a town meeting. It was held in the church, and they got to vote on stuff, everything, whether they would build a road, whether they would raise taxes, everything. The middle colonies are going to incorporate a number of democratic principles from England, and that reflected the basic rights of English people. In the southern colonies, you're going to see stronger ties with Britain, and the plantation owners are going to play the leading roles in the colonial legislatures there. Now in the south, what we're going to see is the growth of a plantation-based agricultural economy in the hot, humid coastal lowlands of the southern colonies, and that's going to require cheap labor on a large scale. So these plantations need people to work on them. Now at first, some of the labor needs, especially in Virginia, are going to be met by what we call indentured servants. Indentured servants are often poorer people from England, Scotland, or Ireland who agree to work on plantations for a short period of time. In return, for the person who's hired them would pay for them to come over on the ships. Alright, so here we have a little diagram, the indentured servant, only 2 more years and I'm free. So that person has had their ticket paid for, and they're basically working for a few years in return for having their ticket paid for. The difference between them and slaves were there for life. Most plantation labor needs eventually came to be satisfied by the forcible importation of Africans. So indentured servants came of their own free will. African slaves were forced to come. Although some Africans at first came as indentured servants and earned their freedom, and some Africans even lived freely during the colonial time period, over time more and more Africans came over and they were enslaved, and they were brought to the southern colonies by the infamous Middle Passage. All right, and you may remember talking about triangular trade during these classes that talked about this stuff, and you'll see there are different triangles. One of the triangles involves, well, actually most of them involved transporting slaves from Africa to either the West Indies or sometimes to North America. And that would be the Middle Passage, that terrible, terrible voyage where slaves would often die on that trip. The development of a slavery-based agricultural economy in the southern colonies eventually led to conflict between North and the South during the Civil War. So one of the biggest factors in causing the Civil War was slavery.